Get her out. This is a billion-dollar room, not a delivery zone. The sentence didn't just land. It shattered the air, cutting through the soft jazz, the low hum of Manhattan traffic 40 stories below, the delicate clink of crystal glasses frozen mid-toast. And for a brief second, time itself seemed to hesitate as every head in the penthouse turned toward the girl by the door, Maya Brooks, standing there in a navy delivery jacket slightly too big for her shoulders, her fingers still wrapped around a small insulated bag, her breath shallow but steady, while across the room Ethan Caldwell stood beneath a chandelier that cost more than most people's yearly rent, his tailored suit flawless, his expression sharper than the skyline behind him. A man who had built empires out of precision and control. A man who did not tolerate disruption. Not tonight. Not with $500 million sitting on the edge of a signature. Not with international investors watching his every move. And certainly not from someone like her. Someone the room had already decided didn't belong. Because in rooms like this, worth was measured before words were ever spoken. And Maya, quiet, uninvited, invisible, had already been priced at zero. Or at least that's what they thought. Because while the laughter rolled lightly across the polished marble floors, while one of the executives waved dismissively toward the hallway, as if she were nothing more than background noise, something unnoticed shifted beneath the surface, subtle as a change in wind before a storm, as the investors across the table leaned closer together, their voices lowering, their English fading into smooth, rapid Mandarin, confident, unguarded, assuming privacy, assuming no one here would follow, their tone casual but calculated, outlining numbers, conditions, hidden terms that twisted the deal into something far less generous than it appeared, their smiles polished, their intentions anything but, and Ethan, for all his brilliance, for all his power, didn't catch a single word, because power can fill a room, but it cannot hear what it does not understand. And that was the moment, the exact second where everything began to tilt, because near the door, still holding that bag, still standing where she had been told not to stand, Maya Brooks heard every word, every quiet clause, every subtle deception sliding beneath the surface of a deal that was about to define a future, and she didn't move, not yet, because moments like this don't announce themselves, they build, they tighten, they wait for the exact breath where silence becomes a choice, and in that silence, between who she was seen as and who she truly was, the entire room stood on a line no one else could see, a line that would soon divide before and after, ignorance and revelation, arrogance and truth, and no one, not the investors, not the executives, not even Ethan Caldwell himself, realized that the one person they had just tried to erase from the room was the only one who could stop what was about to happen next. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass about to crack, as the investors continued speaking in Mandarin, their voices smooth, confident, almost amused, unaware that every word was no longer hidden, unaware that the balance of the room had already begun to shift, and Maya Brooks felt it, that quiet pressure building in her chest, the weight of a decision that did not belong to her job title, but somehow had found her anyway, because she had seen this before, not in penthouses or million-dollar deals, but in smaller rooms where people assumed she could not understand, where conversations changed the moment they thought she was invisible, and for a second she considered walking away, setting the bag down, letting the moment pass like it was never hers to hold, because that was what the world had taught her to do. Stay quiet, stay small, do not interrupt. Spaces that were not built for you. But then one of the investors laughed softly and mentioned a revised percentage, a number that would quietly strip millions from the agreement, hidden behind language and confidence, and something inside her tightened, not anger, not fear, something sharper, something clearer, the kind of certainty that does not ask for permission. And across the room Ethan Caldwell was already reaching for the pen, his focus locked on the contract in front of him, trusting what he could see, unaware of what he could not hear. And that was when Maya moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just one step forward, the kind of step that barely makes a sound but changes everything. Her voice calm when it finally entered the room, not loud, not hesitant, just precise, cutting clean through the polished air. As she spoke in fluent Mandarin, correcting a number, repeating a clause, exposing the quiet shift the investors thought no one would catch, and the effect was immediate, not explosive but absolute. Like a switch flipped in a dark room, the investors froze mid-sentence, their expressions tightening, their confidence slipping just enough to be seen, while the executives around the table looked between them and Maya, confusion turning into realization in slow motion, and Ethan did not move at first, his hand still hovering over the contract, his mind catching up to a moment he had not been prepared for, because power teaches you to expect control, not interruption, not from someone like her, not from someone he had already dismissed without a second thought. And yet there she was, standing steady, her delivery bag still in her hand, her presence no longer invisible, her words hanging in the air with a weight that could not be ignored. And for the first time that night the room was not responding to him. It was responding to her, and the difference was undeniable, because respect had not been given. It had been taken, earned in a single moment of truth. And as the silence settled again, deeper this time, heavier, filled with everything that had just been revealed, one question began to rise quietly in every mind in that room. Not about the deal, not about the numbers, but about her, about who she really was, and how they had all managed to miss it until now no one spoke. But everything had changed, and in rooms like this, silence was never empty. It was filled with recalculation, with pride being quietly rearranged, with power trying to understand where it had just slipped, and Ethan Caldwell finally lowered his hand from above the contract. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a controlled precision that masked the fact that something inside him had shifted, because he was not a man used to being corrected, especially not in front of people whose respect had been built on the illusion that he saw everything before it happened, and yet he had missed this, missed her, and that realization did not sit easily. His eyes moving from the document to the investors, then slowly, deliberately, to Maya Brooks, who still stood near the edge of the room, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, as if she had not just redirected the course of a deal worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. And the investors were the first to recover, their smiles returning, but tighter now, more measured, their tone shifting back into English with careful politeness, adjusting their explanation, reshaping their language as if clarity had always been their intention, but the room could feel it, that subtle retreat, that quiet acknowledgement that the ground had changed beneath them, and one of the executives cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the moment, asking a question that was not really a question, more of an attempt to place Maya back into a category that made sense. But there are moments when people no longer fit the boxes built for them, and this was one of those moments. Because Maya did not rush to explain herself, she did not step forward seeking recognition. She simply set the delivery bag down on the nearest table, the soft sound grounding the room in. Something real, something simple, a reminder of where she had started just minutes ago. And yet nothing about her felt simple now. And Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower than before, not louder, not sharper, but different, carrying a weight that had not been there earlier, asking a single question, direct and unfiltered. Who are you? And it was not the kind of question asked out of curiosity. It was the kind asked when someone realizes they have misjudged something important, something valuable, something that should have been seen from the beginning. And Maya met his gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not submissive, just steady. The kind of steadiness that comes from knowing exactly who you are even when no one else has taken the time to notice. And for a brief moment she considered giving him a full answer, explaining the years, the choices, the path that had led her here. But explanations are often wasted on people who only begin listening after the moment has already passed. So instead she gave him something simpler, something that matched the clarity of what had just happened. She told him that she understood the language they were using, that the numbers did not match what had been presented, that the agreement needed to be reviewed before any signature was placed on it. Her words calm, precise, leaving no room for doubt. And that was when the real shift settled into the room. Not loud, not visible, but undeniable, because authority had just been redefined without permission, without title, without introduction, and everyone could feel it. The invisible line that had once separated her from them had disappeared, replaced by something far more uncomfortable. The realization that the person they had dismissed had been the only one truly in control of the moment, and Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built his reputation on never being the least informed person in the room, understood that better than anyone, and for the first time that night, he did not look at Maya Brooks as a disruption, or a mistake, or an inconvenience. He looked at her as the one variable he had failed to account for, and in that realization, something far more significant than a business deal began to unfold. The room did not return to normal, because moments like this do not reset, they reshape everything that follows, and Ethan Caldwell knew it. He could feel it in the way the air had changed, in the way every person at that table was no longer looking at him for direction first, but glancing, even if only for a second, toward Maya Brooks, measuring her, recalibrating her place in a space that had already rejected her minutes ago. And that shift, subtle but undeniable, was something he could not ignore, because power was not just about control, it was about perception, and perception had just slipped through his fingers in front of people who expected him to hold it effortlessly. So he adjusted, not by raising his voice or asserting dominance, but by doing something far more difficult. He listened, really listened, as he turned the contract slightly toward himself again, his eyes scanning the lines Maya had referenced, the numbers that now carried a different weight, the clauses that suddenly felt less solid than they had moments ago. And across from him, the lead investor leaned back with a composed smile, attempting to reclaim the narrative, offering clarification in smooth, careful English, reframing the discrepancies as minor misunderstandings, cultural nuances, translation gaps. But the confidence was no longer complete. It carried a thin edge now, a quiet awareness that the illusion had been broken. And that was when Ethan made a decision, not rushed, not emotional, but precise, the kind of decision that defined who stayed in control and who lost it. He closed the folder slowly, the soft sound echoing louder than it should have in the silence. And for a brief moment no one moved, because everyone understood what that sound meant. It meant pause. It meant reconsideration. It meant that the deal was no longer inevitable. And then he spoke, not to the investors, not to the executives, but to Maya, asking her, calmly, to repeat what she had heard, to walk him through it. And that request, simple on the surface, carried something deeper, something far more significant, because it was an acknowledgement, a shift in authority that no one could pretend not to notice. And Maya did not hesitate. She stepped forward just enough to be heard clearly, her voice steady as she translated the conversation, line by line, tone by tone, not adding drama, not exaggerating, just presenting the truth as it had been spoken. And with each sentence the room seemed to tighten, the investors' expressions growing more controlled, the executives exchanging glances that said everything they could not say out loud, and Ethan listened without interruption, his face unreadable, but his mind moving quickly, recalculating risk, trust, leverage, and something else, something quieter but just as important, recognition, because this was not luck, this was not coincidence, this was competence, undeniable and precise, appearing where no one had thought to look. And when she finished, the silence returned again, heavier now, filled with understanding rather than confusion, and Ethan finally turned his attention back to the investors, his tone polite but no longer accommodating, asking direct questions, referencing the exact points Maya had exposed. And for the first time that evening the answers were not immediate, not smooth, not perfectly controlled. They were careful, delayed, measured, and that was all the confirmation he needed, because in business, hesitation often speaks louder than certainty. And as the conversation shifted, as the balance of control quietly moved away from those who had entered the room expecting to lead it, one truth settled clearly into place, not just for Ethan, not just for the investors, but for everyone watching, that the person they had dismissed at the door had become the most important voice in the room. And nothing about that could be undone by the time the last question settled into the air. The illusion of control had completely dissolved, not in a dramatic collapse, but in something far more unsettling, a quiet unraveling that no one could stop once it had begun, and the investors knew it, their posture still composed, but their timing no longer perfect, their answers arriving just a fraction too late, just a fraction too careful, and in rooms where millions of dollars moved with a signature. Those fractions mattered more than anything, because confidence was currency, and theirs had just been devalued. while Ethan Caldwell sat back slightly in his chair, no longer leaning forward with urgency, no longer chasing the close, but observing, calculating, reassessing every assumption he had walked in with, because what had been presented as opportunity now looked dangerously close to exposure. And he was not a man who built his empire on blind trust, especially not after watching someone with no title, no introduction, and no permission dismantle the foundation of a deal in less than a minute. And across the table, one of the executives attempted to regain footing, shifting the conversation toward timelines, toward logistics, toward anything that could restore momentum. But momentum does not return once doubt takes hold. It fractures, it slows, it forces every detail into the light whether people want it there or not. And that was exactly where this moment had gone, into the light. And Maya Brooks stood just outside the center of it, not claiming space, but no longer excluded from it either, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had not just altered the trajectory of a negotiation that could define entire careers. And that composure, that refusal to chase recognition, only made her more difficult to ignore, because there was no performance in it, no attempt to prove anything, only clarity, and clarity is something power cannot easily dismiss. And Ethan noticed that. He noticed the absence of ego, the precision of her words, the way she spoke only when necessary and never beyond it. And in a world where people often used noise to simulate importance, that kind of restraint carried a different weight, a more dangerous kind, because it suggested control, real control, the kind that does not need validation. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic of the room completed its shift, not just away from the investors, but towards something new, something unplanned, because now every question, every clarification, every hesitation seemed to orbit around the same unspoken truth, that the most reliable information in the room was no longer coming from the people who had come prepared to lead it, but from the one person who had not been invited to speak at all. And when one of the investors finally offered a revised explanation, softer now, more transparent, adjusting terms that had once been hidden behind language, it was not framed as correction. It was framed as collaboration, as if this had always been the intention, but no one fully believed that version anymore, not after what had been revealed. And Ethan closed the gap completely with a single, controlled sentence, informing them that the agreement would be reviewed by his legal team before any further discussion, his tone respectful but final, leaving no space for negotiation on that point. And just like that, the deal that had once felt inevitable was no longer theirs to control. And in the silence that followed, as chairs shifted slightly and glasses were set down with careful hands, the reality settled in for everyone present, that the outcome of the night had not been decided by status or preparation or even experience, but by awareness, by the ability to hear what others could not, to see what others overlooked. And in that realization, something far more lasting than a business decision took shape. Something that would follow Ethan Caldwell long after this room emptied, long after the contracts were rewritten, because for the first time in a very long time, he had been reminded that power without awareness is fragile, and that the person you choose to ignore may already hold everything you need to see by the time the last question settled into the air. The illusion of control had completely dissolved, not in a dramatic collapse, but in something far more unsettling. A quiet unraveling that no one could stop once it had begun. And the investors knew it, their posture still composed, but their timing no longer perfect, their answers arriving just a fraction too late, just a fraction too careful. And in rooms where millions of dollars moved with a signature, those fractions mattered more than anything, because confidence was currency, and theirs had just been devalued. While Ethan Caldwell sat back slightly in his chair, no longer leaning forward with urgency, no longer chasing the close, but observing, calculating, reassessing every assumption he had walked in with, because what had been presented as opportunity now looked dangerously close to exposure. And he was not a man who built his empire on blind trust, especially not after watching someone with no title, no introduction, and no permission dismantle the foundation of a deal in less than a minute. And across the table, one of the executives attempted to regain footing, shifting the conversation toward timelines, toward logistics, toward anything that could restore momentum. But momentum does not return once doubt takes hold. It fractures, it slows, it forces every detail into the light whether people want it there or not. And that was exactly where this moment had gone, into the light, and Maya Brooks stood just outside the center of it, not claiming space but no longer excluded from it either, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had not just altered the trajectory of a negotiation that could define entire careers, and that composure, that refusal to chase recognition, only made her more difficult to ignore, because there was no performance in it, no attempt to prove anything, only clarity, and clarity is something power cannot easily dismiss, and Ethan noticed that. He noticed the absence of ego, the precision of her words, the way she spoke only when necessary and never beyond it. And in a world where people often used noise to simulate importance, that kind of restraint carried a different weight, a more dangerous kind, because it suggested control, real control, the kind that does not need validation, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic of the room completed its shift, not just away from the investors, but towards something new, something unplanned, because now every question, every clarification, every hesitation seemed to orbit around the same unspoken truth, that the most reliable information in the room was no longer coming from the people who had come prepared to lead it, but from the one person who had not been invited to speak at all. And when one of the investors finally offered a revised explanation, softer now, more transparent, adjusting terms that had once been hidden behind language, it was not framed as correction, it was framed as collaboration, as if this had always been the intention, but no one fully believed that version anymore. Not after what had been revealed, and Ethan closed the gap completely with a single, controlled sentence, informing them that the agreement would be reviewed by his legal team before any further discussion, his tone respectful but final, leaving no space for negotiation on that point. And just like that, the deal that had once felt inevitable was no longer theirs to control, and in the silence that followed, as chairs shifted slightly and glasses were set down with careful hands, the reality settled in, for everyone present, that the outcome of the night had not been decided by status or preparation or even experience, but by awareness, by the ability to hear what others could not, to see what others overlooked, and in that realization, something far more lasting than a business decision took shape, something that would follow Ethan Caldwell long after this room emptied, long after the contracts were rewritten, because for the first time in a very long time, he had been reminded that power, without awareness, is fragile, and that the person you choose to ignore may already hold everything you need to see. The question did not need to be spoken out loud to exist between them. It was already there, steady and undeniable, shaping the space in a way that neither of them could ignore, and Maya Brooks felt it just as clearly as Ethan Caldwell did, that shift from past to possibility, from what had been overlooked to what could no longer be unseen. But she did not rush toward it. She did not lean into the moment the way most people might when standing in front of opportunity, because she understood something that the room had only just begun to learn, that value does not increase just because someone finally notices it. It has always been there, waiting, unchanged by recognition, and so she reached for the delivery bag instead, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric, grounding herself in something familiar, something real, as if to remind both of them that she had not walked into that room seeking anything beyond completing a job, and that distinction mattered, because it placed control firmly back in her hands, not as a reaction, but as a choice, and Ethan noticed that. He noticed the absence of urgency, the lack of expectation, the way she carried herself as if the moment did not define her, as if she defined it, and that realization shifted his approach again, subtle but intentional, because he understood now that whatever came next could not be treated like a transaction. It had to be something else, something more deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice carried that adjustment, measured, respectful, asking her if she had ever considered using her skills in a different setting, not as an assumption, not as a command, but as an opening, and Maya paused, not because she had never thought about it, but because she had, many times, in quiet moments that did not look like this, in spaces that did not come with chandeliers and skyline views. But those thoughts had always ended the same way, with reality stepping in, with doors that did not open, with opportunities that required more than ability, And as she looked at him now, she could see the difference, not just in the setting, but in the way he was listening, the way he was no longer deciding her value before she spoke. And that difference was not small, it was everything. But still, she did not answer immediately, because she was not interested in being placed into another role without understanding the terms, not just of the job, but of the respect that came with it. And so when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, grounded in clarity. She told him that skill alone does not guarantee opportunity. That understanding a language does not mean being invited into the rooms where it matters, and the truth in her words did not accuse, did not confront, but it landed with a precision that could not be dismissed, because Ethan recognized it, not as criticism, but as reality, a reality he had unknowingly contributed to just hours earlier. And for a moment he said nothing, not because he did not have a response, but because some realizations require silence before they can be addressed. And when he finally spoke again, it was different, not just in tone, but in intention. He did not offer a position, he did not make a promise. Instead, he acknowledged what had happened, openly, directly, admitting that he had misjudged her, that he had reduced her to what he saw instead of what she was. And that acknowledgement, simple as it was, carried more weight than any immediate offer could have, because it was not about correcting a mistake in the moment. It was about recognizing the mindset that created it. And Maya listened, her expression unchanged, but something shifted, not in the room, but in the space between them, something quieter, something more lasting, because respect, real respect, is not given through opportunity alone. It is built through understanding, and for the first time that night, that foundation was beginning to take shape, not as a resolution, not as an ending, but as the beginning of something that neither of them had planned. But both now had to consider carefully. The city lights outside did not flicker, they remained steady, indifferent to the quiet transformation happening inside the room. But for Maya Brooks and Ethan Caldwell, nothing felt the same, because once a truth has been spoken and understood, it does not disappear, it lingers, reshaping every choice that follows. And Ethan stood there for a moment longer, not as a man trying to recover control, but as someone recognizing that control had never been the most important thing in the first place, that awareness, real awareness, carried far more weight. And as he looked at Maya, he was no longer seeing a moment, he was seeing a pattern of overlooked potential, of quiet capability existing outside the systems he had trusted for so long. And that realization did not just challenge his judgment, it challenged his entire approach, because it forced him to confront a simple but uncomfortable truth, that the structures he believed identified talent had just failed in the most visible way possible. And Maya could see that shift, not in what he said, but in what he did not say, in the way he paused before speaking, in the way he chose his words with care rather than confidence. And that difference mattered, because it showed that something real had changed, not just in perception, but in intention. And still, she did not move closer. She did not step into the space he was offering, because she understood something he was only beginning to realize, that opportunity without alignment is just another form of being misplaced, and she had spent too much time being placed where she did not belong to rush into it again. So instead she asked a question, simple on the surface but precise in its purpose. She asked him why, not why he was impressed, not why he had changed his tone, but why now, why in this moment, after everything had already been revealed. And the question settled between them with a quiet weight, because it required more than a convenient answer. It required honesty, and Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he did not have something to say, but because he understood that this was no longer a conversation he could navigate with polished responses. This required something else, something unfiltered. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that shift. He told her that it was not just about what she had done, it was about what it revealed, that he had built a system that measured value quickly, efficiently, but not always accurately, that he had trusted processes that favored visibility over substance, and that tonight had exposed the cost of that trust. And there was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to justify it, only recognition. And Maya listened, her expression steady, because she had heard versions of this before, not always spoken out loud, but felt in actions, in missed chances, in doors that never opened. But this felt different, not because of the words themselves, but because of the space they were being spoken in, a space that had once excluded her, now forced to acknowledge her presence. And that shift carried meaning, not just for the moment, but for what could come next. And still, she did not give him an answer, not a yes, not a no, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about choosing carefully, about understanding whether this moment was an exception or the beginning of something consistent. And as the silence returned once more, softer now, less tense, more reflective, both of them stood at the edge of a decision that would extend far beyond the room they were in. Because what had started as a simple interruption had become something far more significant, a confrontation with perception, with value, with the quiet ways people are seen or ignored, and neither of them could step away from that unchanged. Because once you see clearly, you cannot return to not seeing, and in that clarity, the next move mattered more than anything that had come before. The silence did not demand an answer. It invited a choice, and Maya Brooks understood that better than anyone, because moments like this were rare, not because opportunity did not exist, but because clarity did. And as she stood there with the city stretching endlessly behind her, she realized that what mattered now was not what Ethan Caldwell could offer, but what she was willing to accept. And that difference defined everything. Because for years she had adapted to spaces that underestimated her, adjusted to expectations that never matched her ability. But this was different, not because the room had changed, but because she now stood in a place where she could choose, not react. And that choice carried weight, not just for her, but for the way this moment would echo beyond itself. And Ethan waited, not impatiently, not with the urgency that had defined him earlier, but with a stillness that showed he understood the significance of what was happening, because he knew this was not about closing a deal. It was about earning something far more difficult, trust. And trust does not respond to pressure. It responds to consistency, to intention, to proof over time. And as Maya looked at him, she saw that shift clearly, not in promises, not in offers, but in awareness, in the way he no longer assumed he deserved her agreement. And that was enough for her to speak. Not with excitement, not with hesitation, but with certainty. She told him that she was not interested in stepping into a role simply because it was now available, that she had spent too long being overlooked to accept something without understanding where it would lead. And her words did not close the door, they defined the terms of it. Because she was not rejecting the possibility, she was reshaping it, placing value where it had always belonged, in alignment, in respect, in being seen fully and not partially. And Ethan listened, not interrupting, not redirecting, because this was the conversation that should have happened long before this night, the conversation that acknowledges that talent is not discovered, it is recognized. And when he responded, his voice carried none of the authority that once filled the room, only clarity. He told her that he was not asking for an answer tonight, that he understood this was not a moment to decide, but a moment to begin considering something different. Something that would require more than one conversation, more than one proof of change. And that response, simple as it was, carried the one thing she had been waiting to hear: patience. Because real opportunity does not rush you into it. It gives you space to choose it. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke again, because the weight of what had just been established did not need to be filled with words. It settled naturally, quietly, reshaping the space between them into something new. Something neither of them had planned, but both now understood. And as Maya reached for her bag, lifting it from the table with the same calm steadiness she had carried from the beginning, she turned slightly toward the door, not as someone leaving a missed chance, but as someone stepping away with control intact. And just before she moved, she paused, not dramatically, not for effect, but because there was one final truth that needed to be acknowledged, not for him, but for the moment itself. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. She said that people are often seen for what they carry before they are seen for who they are, and that sometimes the difference between being overlooked and being valued is not time, it is attention. And with that, she walked toward the door, her steps steady, her presence no longer invisible. And Ethan remained where he was, watching not as someone who had lost something, but as someone who had just realized how much there was still to learn. Because that night was never just about a deal, it was about perception, about awareness, about the quiet power of being underestimated and the even greater power of proving that assumption wrong without ever needing permission. And long after the room emptied and the city lights continued their endless glow, one truth remained, clear and unshakable. That power can fill a room, but it is awareness that transforms it. And once that transformation begins, nothing inside it stays the same.